Once you've selected the relevant account, you'll be able to start your new calculation. Click plus new property. In the property information section, the first thing you need to do is enter a unique reference for the calculation. This can be an address, say like 1 The High Street, or maybe if you're doing a calculation that is a hypothetical scenario, say for instance once some insulation has been added to the roof, you could call it 1 High Street 400mm of loft insulation. This will ensure you can identify different calculations. You must always enter something into the reference field. Next, you must enter a postcode for the dwelling you are assessing. Again, it is essential this is correct as the software uses the postcode field to auto-complete the location data and design condition fields in the software, which sets the basis for the rest of the calculation. However, you can override these fields. To change the country, you can click the drop down. The altitude, as we mentioned, is derived from the postcode and shows the altitude of the building at ground level. This is especially important if the height is above 100 metres due to increased infiltration that will be included in the final calculation. Moving on to the design conditions section, once again this will be pre-populated based on the postcode you have entered. However, due to the flexibility of the MCS heat load calculator, the values can be overridden if you wish using the override button as shown here. Remember that if you do override certain fields such as design external air temperature, mean annual external air temperature and heating degree days, your calculation may not be MIS 3005D compliant. As a reminder, the design external air temperature is used to determine the temperature difference between the room and external air when calculating the peak heat load for the building fabric. And the default temperature is obtained from the closest weather station to the property as the crow flies, or in other words, straight line distance. The mean external air temperature is based on an entire year and is used as the assumed ground temperature when calculating the heat loss of solid ground floors and basement walls if you have them. Both of these temperatures are shown in Celsius and can be overridden if you wish, as mentioned earlier. Heating degree days is another auto-filled field derived from Met Office historical weather records using a base temperature of 15.5 Celsius. Following this, the property details will need to be entered next. The dwelling type, attachment and age bands are all taken from the RDSAP methodology. So the dwelling type and attachment type require data to determine the number of heat loss surfaces of the dwelling. The age band, that uses building regulation standards from the selected years to determine the U values of the fabric of the building or heat loss surfaces, along with the air changes per hour and design room temperatures. All of these can be selected using the drop-down menus. So in this section we're selecting house, semi-detached, looking at the RDSAP age bands, band A before 1900. Moving on to the number of occupants. This is important as a calculator needs to determine if the number of occupants exceeds what is expected in a property of that size, and if any additional ventilation is required. To do this, you can click on the toggle switch on the left and right, or just type in the number of occupants. Next, the dimension specification needs to be selected. This is essentially how you have measured the property. It is most likely here that net internal will be selected if you have visited the dwelling, as it involves measuring internally from floor to ceiling from the internal faces of the walls on a room by room basis. However, should you wish to select gross internal, you will need to measure from the centre line of the internal walls, and heights are taken from the floor structural level to the same level as the floor above and incorporates the intermediate floor height. Floors and ceiling measurements are taken from the interior face of the boundary external walls to the centre line boundary internal walls. And if you were to measure from plans, you may wish to use gross external, as wall widths are taken from the exterior face of the external wall to the centre line of the internal walls. The height of the wall is the total story for each floor. Floor and ceiling measurements are taken in the same way. Building air tightness can also be entered in 3 different ways. The standard method assumes an infiltration rate based on the number of bedrooms and occupants in the dwelling using SIBSE tables. If an air test has been performed on the dwelling and you have the building envelope area and volume that were recorded during the test, the data can be entered into the measured air permeability section. Finally, if you have a whole house design air change rate, enter this into the air changes per hour in the design air change rate box. Also note, individual rooms air change rates can be altered and added in the heated room section. The final section of the property information requires you to answer if you have a measured HTC or heat transfer coefficient test, and if this has been performed on the dwelling. If so, the details of the test can be entered into the box below.